Yes, I'm very aware of the fact that we're short of time, so I'm kind of going to whiz through. And I apologize for the fact that I'm really going to focus mainly on visual arts, which is my area. But that doesn't mean that I'm not taking note of the work done in dance. I mean, Shima Kirwani is here, or of my late friend Madiha Gohar in theater, or in fact of people like Mushtaq Qaisar in film. But we're looking at some pictures, which I think is a little bit of a relief. And I hope Veena can share some of the images that I sent her earlier, or whoever is handling the sharing of the screen. Because what I'm going to see is very quickly taking you down things that have to do with the state, but also things that have to do with problems that my friend Krishna talked about, which have to do with us who are in this society and are the components who of the people, the artists who have to reflect or at least comment on what's going on. Veena, could we have the first image, which is a work by the artist Afshar Malik? Could we have the screen larger so we can have the image in the center? This is an early work. This was done by Afshar Malik, which is directly from literature because it takes on Faize's poetry. The one on the left is Mere Hamdam Mere Dost. The second is from his poem Bol. And I think the images are self-explanatory. I don't need to talk about what they're doing. They're talking about repression and the fact that you are not allowed to speak. Could we have the next one? And but we're talking about then of women who during this period were like the other vulnerable parts of the populace. So that was women, it was the trade unions, we're talking about Ziaul Haq's regime. It was the minorities, those that became targets for specially targeted during that regime. So you have somebody like Nazish Ataullah who's talking about the fact that the women become these non-persons who are silenced and they are looking through these windows, these apertures, which are beautifully decorated. They are the Mughal screens, but they just become then emblems. Could we have the next one, please? This is one of my own works, which is directly about violence, domestic violence. And I use my own face gagged. This was a very famous case in which this woman was violated in the most indescribable way by her husband, who was a cleric, who was a mullah. So I was really dumbfounded about how to deal with the way that her body was defiled. And looking at, the whole idea of the sacred and the profane, the man is leading the prayers. And yet there is this extreme profanity where it comes to the woman in his life. Surprisingly, the matter was brought up in parliament and nobody spoke except the then prime minister, who happened to be a woman, who then arranged for the woman's medical treatment abroad. Next. But then, humor is something that artists can bank upon, like writers, like poets, like theater people. And this is a work again done during the Zia period by Durya Kazi, in which she's comparing the male and the female. And this kind of the fact that, okay, the female only needs 2.5 meters of cloth for her shalwar, but the male requires 11 yards for his shalwar. So the kind of, it's making fun of the difference, as it were, between male and female, which was the center stage, held center stage during those years, as special laws came in to target the women's status. Could we have the next one, please? And then the woman's body then becomes a space for contention. When the state takes over the woman's body's ownership, where it's decided that, okay, if a woman is raped, unless there are 4 male witnesses, she can be taken into jail for adultery. That is when the body comes back to the female artist for celebration and for defiance. This is the body which is, defined by the handprint of henna handprint, which is a traditional way of, decoration. But in this case, it covers the body. And then the artist takes it out of the studio and into the streets as a blatant throwing down of gauntlet. We have the next one, please. So there they were on the streets of Karachi, where Naya took her students 5 o'clock in the morning before traffic started. And they made these figures on the walls in very busy thoroughfares. And the next one, please. Like this. The fact that they were defiled and taken away later doesn't matter, because she put one next to a barber's shop, an outdoor street barber's shop. And I asked him, because I had gone to see these, and I said to him, you didn't remove the woman who's, was made it near your barber's shop. And he said, no, actually my business has gone up since this image came next door to my shop. So, there were all kinds of reactions. And it's interesting to see how people react. The ordinary person on the street reacts to an artist's intervention in the public space. And the fact when she is actually, confronting what is her role, then there can be a range of responses. Next. And this is Imran Qureshi's work, which won the Sharjah Prize at the Sharjah Biennale. But to walk into the space that I did and have a terrible feeling of what we had recently been experiencing in Pakistan, the rise of extremism and terrorism, and the killing and the carnage in public spaces, especially in mosques of the minorities, like the Shias, like the Ahmadis. And this work happened immediately after that. And it was, you go into the space and your heart stops until you walk in and go slower and look more carefully at what the artist promises, at what will happen after the carnage. Can you go into the next image? And then go further into the detail. Next. And then you see that life revives. There is hope at the end of it, where these blossoms emerge from the carnage. They emerge from the bloodshed, they emerge from the bloodletting, and you know that life is possible after all that you have experienced. So the artist is put in this position of really promising something. This is a work by Adila Suleiman, a Karachi artist. We can have a look at that also. The next one, in which she is looking at the tremendous communal strife which has happened in Karachi over so many decades in different communities. And she's taking something out of tradition, in which she's looking at the legend of the fighters who continue fighting after they've lost their heads. And, they simply continue, the warriors continue. But they find themselves in this field of flowers, where even though blood has been shed, there is still something of beauty that remains with us. Next. And there you are. There is still something that is there out of this, headless warrior, this meaningless strife that is happening, that we deal with in our cities. We try and make sense of, and the artist tries to make sense of that also, and tries to make a promise to those that suffer, that those who experience this, that the artist is there with them for life to continue. Next. Farida Batul is an artist from Lahore, and this is a work called Nahi Risa Shahr Lahore Diyan, which is there's no place like Lahore, which those who live in Lahore know that there is no place like Lahore. But in the back, there is this terrible burning of the city, which took place as a result of the protests against the Prophet's images, that the cartoons that happened in another part of the world, and the city decides to burn itself in protest. And then there's this little girl who's skipping a rope. This is a lenticular print. So when you see this image, actually move in front of it, the rope starts moving. So again, you have the woman, the artist, who is saying, against all of that, what we have done to ourselves in terms of destroying our own city, there is still this little girl who promises that, you know, that there is a Lahore, which is lively, which will live in spite of what is there in the background. If you can look at the next one. Another work by Farida Batul, which is simple enough. I don't need to explain it. And the next. Very quickly, if we can have the next couple of slides. They are from Khadim Ali, who is a Hazara artist now living in Sydney. These are works that he did. And, you know, we know the Hazara community is has one of the most difficult histories of displacement and persecution across our region, across Afghanistan. So Ruby Chishti, who is a sculptor, her works are so endearing. The next image, if you can show of her work, which was, it's a reflection on her own life. And she was born and the family went into tears because another girl child was born. And the work is titled, "My Birth Will Take Place 1,000 Times, No Matter How You Celebrate It." And these are these not quite human sized and not quite doll sized creatures that are made out of remnants of cloth plucked from here, there, and everywhere. And they are so moving. When I showed these in my gallery, I actually showed them outside with this photography. People came off the streets and they immediately responded to this work. There was something so moving, so endearing about these little creatures who were mourning and yet celebrating yet another girl child. Next. Clothesline, which was this artist, Aisha Jatoi, who did this intervention in one of the, you know, we have all these planes and submarines all over Lahore. That's our public art, if you please. And so she took her clothes and she washed them nearby in a public tap, and then she put them out to dry on this, you know, public piece of public art. Pretty soon a police wala came back and said, you know, what you're doing? So she said, I'm drying my clothes. So he said, you can't dry your clothes over here. So she said, you know, is there a law against it? And he was a bit nonplussed. She said, as soon as they're dry, I'll take them away. So it created a lot of merriment around, apart from the fact that it was videoed. So it's been shown 1,000 times all over the world. And, you know, that's a way that an artist actually uses humor, which is one of the strongest weapons, as we know, for all artists all over the world, whether they're poets or they're theater people or musicians or whatever. Next. Sabah Khan, which works with artisans to make sequins and makes these lovely images. This is an old one, but I don't think I need to say anymore, except it's so decorative and so lovely. Next. That's another one of her works, which was to do with the suicide bomber. Again, you know, the moment of explosion, its loss, and that, there you are. Next, and we'll see that, I think now the last few. Imran Mudassar is an artist who lives in Lahore. These are these very quiet works, which don't say much, but they're talking about the weaponization that has happened over the last 2 decades, in which we can't get away from the fact that these weapons are in society and they target, you know, they target life, you know, which is right there in the center. Next. Okay, just very quickly, if you can run these through, because this is a street demonstration by young artists and students, which was against terrorism. It was, they were protesting on the streets against the Taliban. And this is, you know, this was an anti-Taliban. This is, of course, and it says, Aman and Rawadari Hamari Pakistan. They're kind of rejecting what were the instruments of hate and instruments of violence. They were just out on the street. I thought it's nice to know when you have young people participating in something. I mean, young artists, you usually don't expect them to be out there, you know, on the barricades, but they can be. And this, I'm ending with these last few images there's a group called, they work together, they are artists, they're anthropologists, they're just intellectuals and so on. It's the Awami Art Collective. And what they had done was that in this garden, they had on each of these little flags, there was a press clipping of a public killing, whether it was on ethnic grounds, whether it was on sectarian grounds, whether it was a terrorist attack. They covered 10 years of public news, which were printed onto these. And this was in a public garden in Lahore, in the Lawrence Gardens. And people the city people who use that space, they were walking up and they were looking up and they were reading this. And it was coming home to them the number of lives that have been lost over the last 2 decades in public violence that has occurred in our cities and across our country. I think a very tangible evidence which people could look at and they could see for themselves. And this was not in a studio, this was just in a public park. And that was how, this is a top view of it. So, this is artists taking their work with different ways of application. It is not about a product. It's not about, it's about, I think, what Krishna was talking about. It is about criticizing where we live, how we live, and what we can do. And if you can give me a minute, I'd like to end with Faiz, not a piece of poetry, but a piece of prose in which he talks about the role of the artist. And when I find myself, as we've said earlier, compromised or beginning to compromise or trying to navigate, I go back to this. And he writes, my answer, when he was asked, what is the role of an artist? And he said, my answer is and would be, we are the offspring in the direct line of descent of the magicians and the sorcerers and the music makers of old. In times gone by, these ancients of ours could make the rain come down with their incantations. And with their songs, they could make the deserts bloom. And they not only implicitly believed that they had these powers, their community believed it too. This is because they found for their hopes and their fears of their people, for their dreams and longings, words and music that the people could not find for themselves. And by blending their collective will to a desired end, they could sometimes make the dream come true. So that is who we are. We are the inheritors of this magic and the power of the magic in big ways and small, depending on the intensity of our love our hearts possess and on the anguish we share with an anguished world, on the measure of our strength to defy what is evil and to uphold what is good. And thus, as a writer or artist, even though I run no state, I command no power, I'm entitled to feel that I'm my brother's keeper and my brother is the whole of mankind. And this is the relevance to me of peace, of freedom, of détente, and the elimination of the nuclear menace. But out of this vast brotherhood, the nearest to me and the dearest are the insulted and humiliated, the homeless and the disinherited, the poor, the hungry, and the sick at heart. Thank you so much.